Hi, welcome back guys. This is your Sensei, back with another fanfiction. This is the movie of What If Naruto Fell in Love with Elizabeth? Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. I exist. Elizabeth. Tails heads. Or tails. Booker Dewitt bit back a silent snarl as he pushed past the gate, only to find himself confronted by a stately young man and woman. So alike they might have been twins, were it not for their opposing gender. The former wore a chalkboard around his chest, tallying the number of heads and tails, with the former being in the clear majority, whilst the latter offered a simple platter. Had they made everyone who'd passed through the gate flip a coin to gain entry? It certainly seemed so. Come on, he sighed, let me through. Heads, the man asked again, flipping a coin towards him, or tails? His companion repeated, the slightest of smiles tugging at her full lips. Booker caught the coin in his right hand with ease, realizing he wouldn't be able to pass without indulging in their little game. Briefly he weighed his decision. Heads. Or tails? Heads. No, wait. Something made Booker change his mind at the last instance. Tails. He tossed the coin toward the platter before he could change his mind a second time, half expecting it to turn up as heads merely out of spite for him. Imagine his surprise when instead it turned up as the very same eventuality he'd predicted. The man seemed genuinely surprised by this outcome. This is unexpected. The woman murmured to herself, marking off the result as a single tally on the opposite side of the board. I didn't find that as satisfying as I'd imagined. Find what's satisfying? Winning. It's not winning if you're the one losing. Her companion pointed out with a sour face. Chin up. The woman replied, taking the man's arm and tugging him aside. The outcome should prove more interesting this time. I suppose it will. Booker brushed past the pair as they continued to prattle on. Honestly, what did it matter if he'd landed tails instead of heads? It wasn't as if his entire fate hinged on the turn of a coin, right? He could hear a chorus in the far distance, singing "Goodnight Irene, good night," a cacophony of lilting voices growing louder with each passing second. He had to make his way to Monument Island, which, if this singing was any indication, was drawing nearer with each and every step. He couldn't afford any delays. Despite this, it was impossible to ignore that was when he received quite the nasty shock. No sooner had he begun to lower his guard, no sooner had he slowed to take in the majesty and marvel that was this city in the sky, than he found himself face to face with the hand of the devil itself, or at least, Columbia's depiction of it. Barring his path a sign depicting a hellish hand, fingers crooked into claws. Above and below it read, "You shall know the false shepherd by his mark." What the? Booker balked at the sign, because his right hand bore those very same initials burned upon the back of his palm for all the world to see. That couldn't be right, could it? He subconsciously covered his right hand with his left and hurried on, careful what was all this false shepherd business about. And what did it have to do with him? Struggling to stifle his own gorge, and a rising sense of dread, DeWitt pressed on, his wonder withering to ash in his mouth. I'm getting a bad feeling, ain't this splendid? He heard Fink's laughter just beyond the courtyard. Supposedly the man was responsible for many of Columbia's marvels, including possession the very same vigor he'd used to secure entry to the raffle. He seemed a pleasant enough sort, but as he knew, appearances often proved deceiving. A sly smile oft hit a dagger in the back, or so the saying went. Dwight lingered at the staircase a little moment longer before taking the plunge, descending slowly so as not to draw undue attention to himself. Such a thing was impossible given all those gathered below, but he could dream, couldn't he? Remaining inconspicuous soon proved to be the least of his worries, however. And knew the 1912 raffle has officially begun. Booker cringed slightly at the exuberance in Fink's voice as he drew nearer. Did the man have to be so insufferably loud? His singing had been exuberant enough from a distance, but here, this close to the stage, it was nigh unbearable. A loud roar went up from the crowd nevertheless. Apparently they couldn't get enough of the man's incessant prattling. Try as he might, he couldn't find a way through the crowd. For a moment he considered forcing his way through, but at what cost? He didn't want to draw any undue attention to himself, at least not until he was forced to. But what now? He'd never be able to find the girl, not at this rate. Time was of the essence. For every second he wasted in this wondrous world, it was another he drew further away from his objective. Unbidden, the words rang in his mind once more. Bring us the girl and wipe away the debt. He had to know he must clear that accursed debt. Idly, he wondered what could be so special about this girl that he had to bring her to New York. What indeed, hey? A sharp cry dragged DeWitt from his reverie, bringing him back to the present. Hey, mister. Someone called to him within the throng. Mister. Wouldn't you like a ball? Booker finally caught sight of her in the crowd. A young girl of roughly 20 years of age, clad in a festive blue blouse bearing her shoulders to the sunny sky. He almost arched an eyebrow at her red and white striped skirt, but refrained at the last instant as he saw the basket of baseballs slung around her neck. Closer inspection revealed that nearly everyone in the crowd had one, likely the reason she'd called out to him in the first place. Hey, handsome. She waved, beckoning him closer. Here. Booker contemplated her a moment longer, weighing his options. It wasn't as if he had anything to lose by trying. Who knows? He mused. Maybe I'll win passage to Monument Island, a thought occurred to him. He hadn't any money. How was he to participate in the raffle without cash? Simple. He wasn't. Sorry, he rebuffed her gently. No sale? Silly, she giggled, bobbing her shoulders at him. There's never a charge for the raffle. You been sleeping under a rock. Well, reluctantly, Booker plunged his right hand into the basket, fingers wrapping around the first baseball he could find, silently hoping he'd picked a winner. He removed it from the basket and showed it to the girl, startled as much by the number itself as well as his sudden slide of luck. 77. He murmured as much to himself as the girl. Strange. He couldn't remember the last Timmy that had happened. He wasn't one to look a gift horse in the mouth. However, it's 77, the woman purred, delightedly. Well now, that is a lucky number. She turned away from him doubtless to pass out more ball, but not before breathing one last farewell in DeWitt's ear. I'll be rooting for you, handsome. Booker let his gaze linger on her hips a little longer than it should have, and likely would have kept there. 77. A young voice chuckled as soon as she was out of earshot. Poor bee. Excuse me. DeWitt turned, half expecting the voice to melt back into the crowd. Instead he found himself face to face with a young man of Oriental origin, a mop of sandy blonde hair obscuring most of his face, but not his keen blue eyes. They were fixated intently upon the baseball clutched within his hand. He was dressed as most of the menfolk were, and yet, there's something off about him. Nothing about the youth suggested he was any sort of threat, not the way he held himself, nor his attire, not even the keenness of his gaze made him suspect. His words, however, were another matter. It's always 77, isn't it? The man chortled softly as he proffered up a baseball of his own. Another 77. Well, would you look at that? He smiled, and for a moment, just a moment, those serene sapphire orbs weren't sapphire anymore. They were a sinister shade of vile vermilion. I've got your number, DeWitt. Without another word the blonde pocketed the baseball and began to turn away, silent as the grave, disappearing into the crowd like a ghost. Something about that smile sent a shiver shooting up DeWitt's spine. How the hell did this whelp know his name? Before he knew what he was doing, his arm reached out, grabbing the young man by the shoulder before he could vanish and spinning him around to face him. To his surprise, the blonde didn't even so much as struggle. If anything, he seemed surprised. Hey kid. He began like an iron trap, the blonde's gaze locked onto DeWitt's own. The sheer intensity of its stare, the sudden ice in its expression, was enough to silence Booker. Nothing moved. Nothing at all. And then he spoke, his voice black as pitch, eyes cold as the coldest winter. My name, the blonde bit out, is not Kid. It's Naruto. Look, Naruto, he amended at the blonde's cross-expression. How do you know my name? You really do have no clue, don't you? The lad, he couldn't have been more than 20, swung around with a start, shrugging of DeWitt's hand as though were naught but a feather. His whiskered face was twisted with scorn and derision, but his eyes held perhaps just a sliver of sympathy. I'll let you in on a little secret. He drew closer, his words little more in a whisper. you've changed things. There's no going back. You chose tails instead of heads this time, didn't ya? Well, since you chose tails, here I am. In other words, we finally meet. Who knows, the circle might be broken this time. His gaze softened as he peeled away, patting him once upon the shoulder. Remember, DeWitt, ain't no such thing as luck. You make your own, you know. Good or bad. Booker couldn't make heads or tails of the man's words at all. Before he could ask what he meant by them, however, bring me the bowl. Fink cried from atop the stage. Soon enough, the ball-bearer presented herself. Is that not the prettiest young white girl in all of Columbia? He laughed, drawing cheers from the crowd. Not from a certain blonde. Naruto spat in derision. Pretty. He doesn't know the meaning of the word. Why, back in my village we had Fink's words drowned out whatever else he might have said. All right, then the winner is number 77. Booker couldn't quite keep the smile from his face. Well, what do you know over here? Over here. The baseball vendor cried, shouting to make herself heard above the din. Him. He's the winner. Number 77, come and claim your prize. Fink declared as the velvet curtain began to roll back from the stage. First throw. First throw, the crowd chanted. First throw. First throw. First throw. At first, DeWitt didn't understand. What did they mean by first throw? But then, as the curtain parted, his stomach sank to his toes. A young couple, a white man and a black woman, were forced onto stage, their hands bound as the crowd cheered him on. He would be the first to throw the baseball. The first stone. Begging and pleading, sobbing and weeping, they were forced to stand and face their fate. And there was nothing Dwight could do about it, nothing he could say to avert the tragedy about to befall them. Or was there? BSRD. Beside him, Naruto hissed out a breath. Booker turned toward the blonde, startled to find that the boy was already shoving his way toward the stage, obviously intent on freeing the poor couple. Booker didn't envy him a task like that. He was bound to attract more trouble than was worth. Still, he wished him luck all the same. Come on, are you gonna throw it? Fink goaded him giddily. Or are you taking your coffee black these days? Booker didn't bother to weigh the options this time. Staying concealed wasn't worth letting these poor people be stoned to death by baseball. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see Naruto storming toward the stairs, making strange gestures with his hands, and then he was gone. 1 minute the blonde was there, the next, an indefatigable blur took its place, rippling with movement as it crept toward the couple. What in the hell? Booker could barely believe his own eyes. If he hadn't seen the blonde for himself, he wouldn't have believed it. That same blur was unseen by the crowd, by Fink, by anyone, save DeWitt. They were far too focused on all the festivities, of watching him throw the ball. But he wouldn't be throwing it at the couple. Not today. Oh, I'll throw something, you son of a beach. The second before the baseball left his palm, an officer grabbed him by the hand. It's him, he shouted, resting Booker's wrist to the side, exposing his mark. There was a silence. The crowd fell still, all nervous anticipation and apprehension as Jeremiah stooped to look, first at Booker's hand, then square at the man himself. Naruto was no longer anywhere to be seen, nor was the couple. He'd probably freed them in the confusion and slipped out through the curtain. He hadn't long to ponder it, however, as a hand wrenched his head back in Fink's direction. Now, where'd you get that brand, boy? Fink sneered, his mustache rising, lips pulled back into a snarl. Don't ya know that makes you the backstabbing snake in the grass, false shepherd? Cries of horror and dismay rose from the audience. All eyes were now fixed on DeWitt and DeWitt alone. And we ain't letting no false shepherd into our flock. He flung up his arms in exultation, stirring up the crowd and the officers holding DeWitt down. Show him what we got planned, boys. One of the officers moved a strange contraption before his face, its hooks circling menacingly. OSHT. Booker bristled as time began to slow, as the deadly device drew ever closer. Without thinking, he tossed the ball up into the air, catching attention of the unarmed man holding his right arm. Sure enough, his gaze drifting toward the baseball, his grip falling slack for a slim second. That was all he needed. DeWitt didn't think, he acted. A cry of horrified dismay rose from the crowd as DeWitt tore his arm free, grabbed the guard by the back of the head and shoved him forward. placing him directly in the path of the skyhook's circling claws. There was a sickening snap, crackle and pop as the whirling gears pulped the man's face, spurting gore in every direction. The resulting impact tore the skyhook free from his compatriot's arm, wedging itself against the bone and flesh of his visage amidst the. Booker didn't waste any time in snatching it up and donning, but now that very same guard now had a pistol leveled before his face. Dewitt froze, knowing that even with his new weapon, he wouldn't be able to reach the man in time. SHT, would you kindly stop cursing? Booker balked as the Naruto dropped down behind the officer like a wraith, seized his head from behind, and gave a vile twist, snapping his neck like so much timber. There was a moment of stunned silence as he slumped to the ground, a second of surreal calm whilst the good people of Columbia witnessed the act of cold-blooded murder. Then a woman screamed. Her cry was echoed by another and still yet another, until everyone was screaming, running and tripping over one another as they ran for their lives. The young man vaulted backward, somersaulting over the heads of the crowd to a light at the foot of the stairs. He saw Dewitt and waved. Are you going to stand there all day or what? Booker had just taken his first steps forward when he heard it. Stop them, Fink cried. Stop them. The false shepherds have come to lead our lamb Astroweirg. His words ended in a choking gurgle as a hand locked around his throat, knocking the top hat from his head in a flourish of motion. Cruel crimson eyes lofted before his vision as he found himself hoisted high, lifted from his feet, as though he weighed no more than a cross child. He found his vision beginning to blur at the edges as his aggressor's grip tightened, an insecapable vice from which he could not wrest himself. And who was holding him? Uzumaki Naruto. The other Naruto snorted. Looks like Dewitt really did break the circle this time. He tilted his head aside, a slow, sinister smile drawing the corners of his mouth into a cruel smile. Ordinarily I've been shot to death by the police at this point. Fascinating how one little change can affect everything else. Wouldn't you agree? Oh. Fink gasped, his face beginning to purple around the edges. Please. Don't kill me, begging won't help. Naruto admonished. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. His gaze slid across the stage toward Booker, standing gobsmacked at the stairs. Would you care to watch, Mr. Dewitt? I'm sure you'll find his death just as satisfying as I will. What how? Dewitt did a double take, because Naruto was still standing there on the edge of the stairs, yet he also occupied the center of the stage. How was that possible? Did it have something to do with a vigor? He found those dispelled as Blonde raised his free hand and opened his palm, exposing a spiraling sphere clenched against his fingers. It grew larger with each second, until it encompassed roughly half the size of Fink's face. A twitch of the wrist brought the arm back, its keening cry rising over Fink's increasingly desperate pleas. I'll give you money. Well, power. Anything. John, Naruto flexed his fingers and brought the sphere barreling forward to end the life of Jeremiah Fink. What Booker heard next would be burned into his brain for the rest of his life. It was not so much the sight of Jeremiah's head disintegrating into bloody mist, nor was it the sight of the gore-soaked blonde standing before him. It was a word. One word, a single series of syllables, uttered just before Naruto had driven that deadly sphere into Fink's face. Rasengan. To see a wrong and not expose it, is to become a silent partner to its continuance. Sage Uzumaki Naruto was perversely pleased with himself. Finally he was free of this accursed loop. What's more, the rest of his abilities yada had also returned unto him. Sweet blessed chakra coursed through his veins, empowering each strike, allowing him to crush men's skulls like cardboard, and that was without Sage Mode. With Sage Mode, well, it was like shooting fish in a barrel, as the saying went up here. Naruto had never truly understood that saying until now. Now as he ruthlessly ripped a chunk of flesh from an officer's arm, he understood. These men were no match for him. It was all they could do to flee, and even then he picked them off one by one. Fish in a barrel indeed. Don't you need a weapon? He heard Booker's shout echo somewhere behind him. Nope. Naruto answered as he boxed a man in the face, effectively shattering his lower jaw. And it was true. He didn't. He knew how to wield the weapons but chose not to. He'd much rather get up close and personal with his enemy at the moment, watch the light leave their eyes as they died. And he did just that, sullying his suit with BLD and gore for each victim sent to the underworld. Those he didn't reach, Booker made rather short work of with his pistol, or turned on one another with the possession vigor. Naruto wasn't quite sure how he felt about this Booker Dewitt, this ally of his. He'd seen the man countless times in the loop, yet never had a chance to speak to him, to warn him of what was to come. But now that the man had chosen tails, they had met and the accursed loop was dead and gone. Or was it? Was he destined to escape from one paradox only to become trapped in another? He didn't want to think about that. Just a thought like that was nearly enough to drive him to madness. He would make it to the tower this time, and he would get the hell out of this world and back to his own. Just how he knew the tower entailed this, he knew not. Only that something was tugging him in that direction like a siren call, whispering his name over and over. Agony. Naruto, call out the fireman. Fireman. Naruto frowned at the cry. He didn't like the sound of that one. From what little the loop had allowed him to see of this world, he was beginning to learn that anything related to fire was foul. Fire bad. Fire very bad. A laugh danced on the edge of his lips at the thought. He was going to enjoy exacting punishment on the ones who had brought him to this world, more so those who'd trapped him in this infernal loop. But first, he'd entertain these fools, these cretins. Who dared to think he could stand in his way? Grinning, he raised a hand. He was going to enjoy this. Chodama supremely. Booker was left aghast as his unlikely ally made short work of the police. The man moved like a creature possessed, breaking necks and severing limbs like it was no one's business. And all without any kind of weapon to aid him. Bare-handed. On occasion he would utilize strange symbols with his attacks, creating copies, living, breathing clones to assist him in his extermination. Booker still believed there was some strange sort of vigor at work here. After all, one did not simply create copies of oneself without assistance. He wanted to be shut of this madness. Get the girl, bring her to New York, and be shut of this maddened world. And yet Naruto was doing most of the work for him, so why was he stopping on a sudden? Why, for that matter, was the blonde raising his hand? Lord Cho Odama Raisengan? Dewitt nearly ducked as a spiraling sphere, even larger than the last, came crashing down upon the hapless squad of soldiers. Naruto tossed it like a bowling ball, obliterating them like pitiful pins. Strike! The blonde cackled madly to himself as he skipped back to Booker's side. Was the man actually enjoying himself? It certainly seemed so. It's the fireman, came the cry as Booker obliterated a hapless turret. He's here. He'll take care of those Sansa beaches. Naruto and Booker exchanged a terse glance. Did he just say fireman? The former Pinkerton grimaced. I think so. Naruto shrugged. What's a fireman? I thought you knew. I thought you did. Well, I don't. But I thought you did. Obviously I don't. Booker opened his mouth to reply. Snapped it shut. We're starting to sound like those twins, aren't we? Quite. Naruto agreed. Let's stop then. Let's. Together, they strode down the street without another word, leaving Booker keenly aware of the blonde's rapid pace. This Naruto fellow certainly seemed to know where he was going, or at the very least he had a good sense of direction. He couldn't bring himself to be certain of either. And how could he walk about with his clothes in such a state? Naruto was still covered in BLD from his gory exploits, his suit utterly soiled by streaks of black and crimson viscera. What's more, he seemed utterly unfazed by it. Oh, this. Naruto blinked, tugging at a tattered sleeve. I suppose I should undo the genjutsu now. No point in pretending to be something I'm not now that we've come this far, you know. Genwa. Rather than explain, the shinobi pressed his hands together. His clothes seemed to shimmer, the pinstriped suit and tie vanishing in a haze of murky fog. When Booker could finally see properly, he was mildly alarmed to find the boy was clad in something he'd never seen before in all his life. A dull green vest covered the entirety of his chest, laid atop a dark-sleeved shirt ending in formidable-looking bracers on either arm. Loose slacks had replaced the pinstriped pants he'd been wearing less than a minute before, flaring out to reveal open-toed sandals as his chosen footwear. A strange metal band circled his forehead, pushing up the tattered mess of his hair. What was that insignia? It looked like he a leaf. The blonde stretched with a pleasant sigh. You have no idea how good it feels to be back in my old tuning gear again. It's been years since I wore dashed. His smile was swift to fade, however, as he turned his attention to Booker, finding him listening intently. Never mind. Sobered by some thought or another, the blonde pressed on ahead of him. I should warn you though, he advised as they neared the gate, things are about to become very strange for you, Mr. Dewitt. No kidding. And will you stop calling me that? He sighed. I told you back in the plaza, it's Booker. Just Booker will do. The Oriental gentleman snickered on a sudden. He seemed to find something infinitely amusing about what had just been said. He guffawed, his chest rising and falling with rapid breath, nearly heaving with unabashed mirth. Baffled by the blonde's burst of enthusiasm, he could only wait for his fit of giggles to subside before asking the burning question. What's so funny? Oh, nothing. Naruto chuckled, wiping a mirthful tear from his right eye. It's just a sudden explosion stole his words. They exchanged a glance. I suppose that's our cue. Naruto strode forward, stopping just within range of a large gate, placing his back to it. He gestured imperiously, a smile prancing at the edges of his mouth. Would you kindly, Booker-san? It getting hot? Booker gasped, keenly aware of the sweat beading upon his brow as he pushed open the gate. What's going on? They soon found their answer. Standing there in the square was a creature straight out of nightmare. It had been a man, once. No longer. Trapped in an Iron Maiden-esque suit from head to toe, the poor soul loosed a searing scream to greet the two of them, its keening mournful cries reverberating within its metal helm. With a roar, it stomped towards them. And then it started flinging fireballs. Great, blazing ball of fire, as though they were grenades. A rattling of sound and fury reverberated beyond its helm as it stormed forward. Burn in the name of the Prophet? Naruto blanched. Incoming. The pair of green dumpsters next to them suddenly exploded as the flaming missiles descended upon them, missing the pair by a hair's width before incinerating the metal containers. Naruto rolled off to the side as the fireman's blast extinguished upon the concrete, the sleeves of his uniform sizzling from the heat, his eyes burning like hot coals as he gazed across the burning plaza. With a quick twist of his body, he spun himself off the concrete and quickly launched into the air at his Grotzook. It was DeWitt's turn to blanch. What on earth was he thinking? Oh great! Booker growled, his molars grinding in aggravation as he sought shelter behind a building and opened fire with the pistol. As if their situation weren't dire enough. Now they had a monster flinging fireballs at them. What more could possibly go? Eat this? Naruto's enraged cry reverberated across the charred landscape to ring sound in his ears. Booker saw him make those strange symbols with his hands again. This time no clones emerged. The blonde drew in a mighty breath, his chest swelling with rising air. Before he could ask just what the devil he was doing, he exhaled. Sharply. Swaden. He hissed angrily, his eyes flashing a scintillating shade of scarlet. Miserapa. For once, Booker shared the fireman's disbelief. This had to be another vigor, this tidal wave of water that burst from the blonde's lips to sweep across the flaming plaza to extinguish the flames. Naruto exhaled for a second time. A tight, concentrated pulse slammed into the unprepared fireman, ripping him from his feet like a thing alive. A mournful wail left that suit as the blast flung him over the wall, through a gondola, and cast him over the edge to his doom. He dropped something as he fell, the item clattering at the ledge. A bottle. Booker bent to retrieve it, contemplated the crimson bottle. Devil's embrace. He eyed the flask warily. Another vigor. Lord knew he could use the help. Well, you only live once. DeWitt? Naruto warned. I wouldn't. Unscrewing the cap, the former Pinkerton knocked a bit back and forced himself to swallow. That was a mistake. Scarce had he done so than he felt it. He could only yelp in shock and surprise as he began to burn like wildfire, the flesh of his hands charring away beneath a smoldering wave of heat. The flask slipped from his now skinless hands, leaving him writhing in agony. And then, just when he was certain it would grow no worse, that he could take no more, the pain stopped. Booker blinked through the red haze and marveled at his hands. They were complete. untouched. Oh, had it all been an illusion then? A figment of his own imagination? He flexed his fingers, just to be certain. Well, he coughed, that wasn't no sample. That one never gets old. Naruto never did have a chance to finish that sentence, because a nearby gate swung open, disgorging a horde of officers. Talk later. Booker growled. Shoot now. Naruto rolled his shoulders in a shrug and followed him into the Blue Ribbon restaurant. Remarkably, he held his silence until they reached the bar. Not this again. We have company, the gentleman announced, pausing in his cleaning of the bar counter. We do indeed. Why are you following me? Booker demanded. I mean us, he amended at Naruto's displeased grunt. We were already here. The gentleman replied. Why are you following us? Aperitif. His companion inquired. Naruto snickered again. Booker glowered. Some inside joke you want to let me in on? Oh no. The blonde shook his head in the negative. It's just amusing, you know. He returned his attention to the enigmatic pair, his gaze gliding to the tray the woman held and the strange, golden vial perched atop it. You might want to drink that, though. DeWitt arched an eyebrow. Naruto shrugged. Or not. If you fancy dying what was that? Booker gagged. The woman remarked. Surprising. Surprising that it worked, her companion inquired. Surprising that it didn't kill him. But a magnetic repulsive field around one's body can come in handy. If it doesn't kill you, a fair point. Booker sighed as they pressed on, leaving the odd pair behind. It wasn't all that long before they encountered their next obstacle, a lack of solid ground to traverse. The only feasible way across appeared to be a select number of hooks hanging from the rooftop. DeWitt eyed the skyhook on his arm thoughtfully. Nothing to lose except his life. And everything to gain. He drew back several paces. Maybe I could hook onto them with the skyhook? With a running leap, he lunged for the hook, only to be yanked upright. Oh! He cried. DMN thing must be magnetized. Naruto's laughter echoed somewhere to the south of him, and it was only then that DeWitt realized their conundrum. The blonde didn't possess a skyhook of his own. Over here. Booker nearly fell from the hook, such was his shock. The man was standing on the wall beside him, grinning from ear to ear. Standing. Defying the very laws of gravity themselves. How the hell are you doing that? Booker balked. What kind of vigor is vigor? Naruto scoffed. Police. This is chakra. What? The blonde pressed 2 fingers to his lips, his gaze sliding toward a nearby landing. A lone guard patrol just below, blissfully unaware of the 2 men hanging over his head. He whistled tunelessly, glanced this way and that, but finding nothing, continued on. Naruto eyed the guard with an almost predatory grin. Shall I? He inquired. Do it. Booker agreed. With a running start and a blood-curdling war whoop, the blonde leapt from the wall's edge and landed firmly atop the guard, driving the hapless man to the ground in a tangle of arms and limbs and strangled curses. The man's struggles quelled the moment the shinobi's hands latched onto his neck and gave a savage twist. Even as he fell, the blonde was already moving on, pouncing upon a hapless guard armed only with a billy club. He was almost grateful for the fog, Booker was, as a blood-curdling scream grated his ears. By the time Booker managed to land, Naruto had already dispensed of the last of them. Everyone stay calm. A female voice blared through the loudspeakers of a nearby gunship. And lock your doors if you can. It swept closer still, revealing a host of soldiers, each armed to the teeth. And still, the voice droned endlessly on. The prophet foresaw this day would come, and he is prepared. The answer is not in panic, but in prayer. We must pray. Booker turned, just in time to witness Naruto's body lock up. The blonde froze in mid-step, his eyes bulging so large he was certain they'd bulge right out of his head. Then he began to grin. A tiny smile broke out on Naruto's chiseled face, like a crack etching along a stone surface. He laughed, then. It was a deep, throaty sound, not a thing like himself. The wind, keening like a lost child, stirred his ragged blonde hair, caressing it with cold fingers, gathering in the palm of his hand as DeWitt looked on. I am getting real tired off hearing this SHT. Naruto snarled, his pupils dilating as increased adrenaline began to pump through his system, his visible eye blue and bright with bloodlust. DeWitt wondered nervously as he watched the man. A thrill of fear ran its flighty fingers up his spine. Just who the hell is this guy? Naruto's teeth gleamed wolfishly in the shadow of his ragged locks. You might want to step back a bit, DeWitt. His voice rose over the din. I wouldn't want you to be caught in the backlash. Ah, here it comes. The keening of the wind erupted into a furious roar, a veritable tornado swirling in his palm, compressed into a sinister sphere. Booker balked at it, his crew balked at it, hell, everyone did. Naruto moved his hand toward the skies, his scream lost over the howling storm. That's some screech, the former Pinkerton winced, cringing as the wind whipped itself higher and higher. Even at this range, he found he had to cover his own ear just to drown out the incessant shrieking of the rising maelstrom. The bitter keening of the wind rose in pitch, scouring the tormented hell that they found themselves in. And still it spiraled higher, sparking and spitting in the blonde's upturned palm. His eyes flashed a foul crimson color, his pupils snapping slitted as he brought his arm back to launch the massive technique. Would you kindly step aside? He asked pleasantly. Booker Dewitt had less than an instant to register these words before Naruto flung his technique forward. He lurched into motion, arching his back in mid-lunge. His hair blew across his face, as something passed with impossible speed overhead. He glimpsed nothing more than a ripple in the air itself, the faintest wisp of steam or mist wadded into a ball like so much discarded parchment. Had he not been looking right at it, indeed, expecting something very much like it, he'd never have known it was there. The gunship didn't even have time to bank away. One moment Naruto was holding it, the next he flung it, just like its namesake. Raisin Shuriken. The world erupted. Sundered stone and shattered debris was the BLD of the sky, gushing from the wound inflicted by its attacker's invisible hammer. A ferocious tide slammed into Booker, threatening to knock him from his feet and fling him off the edge of Columbia. For the first time he was actually grateful of his grip on the nearby guardrail. BLD bullets, bits of cloth, even a smattering of dead bodies and arms rained across them, blinding Booker to almost anything, everything else. He dared to open an eye. Naruto looked on, smug with satisfaction. As he looked on, the blonde raised a hand, pressed his thumb and index finger together. A smaller, but by no means less deadly Raisin Shuriken hung between them. Naruto raised his arm, drew his wrists back in preparation. Wait for it, he made a flicking motion with his fingers and the world burned white. DeWitt's ears rang with a second, deafening crack, followed by an equally enormous explosion as something undoubtedly that gunship dropped from the sky, sinking like a stone. BLD spattered his face, the surface of the floor itself roiling against his legs, and even without sight Booker Dewitt knew something had happened. Even as he struggled to come to terms with it all, he could hear Naruto speaking to him. Just as he could feel the blonde tugging at his arm, guiding him onward while his vision recovered. Come on, the sage muttered, ushering him forth. We can't keep that little lady waiting now, can we? Numbed, Booker allowed himself to be led on. And all the while he wondered, just who are you, Naruto? I exist. Elizabeth. Tyr, just what the hell are you? Booker demanded 7 soldiers, 6 turrets, and 5 firemen later. A man. Or a devil? I am not, nor have I ever been a devil. Naruto admonished as he applied some much-needed pressure to DeWitt's dislocated shoulder, clucking softly to himself whenever the older man tried to squirm away from the painful wrenching of his limbs. I'm a sage. And unlike you, I can take a little bit of pain. So stop squirming. The former Pinkerton bit back a hiss, struggling to keep still as the blonde set his joint and prepared to shock it back into place with that uncanny strength of his. He'd dislocated it trying to ram a skyhook into a fireman's face, with unpleasant results. Not only had the man-made inferno melted his weapon into useless slag later, forcing him to procure another, but he'd been burned and knocked his shoulder out of alignment. If Naruto hadn't come to his rescue, he might not be sitting here, griping over his injury. That'd be the last time he'd be getting up close and personal with one of those deadly demons ever again. He had no regeneration to speak of. He was all too vulnerable to flying firebombs and bullets. Now he was feeling even more vulnerable, with his arm out of sorts. He was keenly aware just how precious little he knew about Slash of his supposed ally. Why the blonde had chosen to aid Booker in the first place, why he was still aiding him even after all this, remained beyond him. The sage. He frowned at length. Don't even know what that is. That's because you're not meant to know. His unlikely ally murmured. By the way, Booker-san, what's your favorite color? Red. And what kind of question is that? His words ended in a roar of pain as the sage popped his arm back into place with a sharp pop. BSRD. Why didn't you warn me? Sorry. For once, Naruto looked and sounded genuinely apologetic. Thought it'd be best to distract you while I set your arm there. Wouldn't do for you to move around and make me break the joint all over again now, would it? Testing the strength of his restored limb, Booker had to agree with him. The last thing he wanted was to experience that sort of pain again. Clever Sinuva Beach, he admitted. Unfortunately, Naruto took immediate offense to his incautious wording. My mother was no such thing. Right, sorry. Now it was Booker's turn to apologize, abashed by the boy's fury. Didn't mean anything by it. I meant to say that was smart of you. To distract me, well, why didn't you just say so? Naruto's grin was positively beatific. Maybe there's hope for you yet, Booker-san. You really should thank me more often. I did. DeWitt detracted. Did you? Was that what you meant? I think so. But do you know? It was clear to him now that the sage was enjoying himself, taking a perverse pleasure in this little verbal game of theirs. I do. Booker bit back. Excellent, but we're doing it again, aren't we? Doing what? That thing we did before. Let's stop then. Naruto decided. Can't having it growing old and tattered and whatnot, right? Having taken refuge in one of the many abandoned buildings littering Columbia, the pair had taken the opportunity to refuel and resupply. Naruto his chakra and Booker his salts and ammunition. Apparently the blonde couldn't exactly hurl those raisin shuriken things willy-nilly as he'd first suspected. He'd claimed it drained 2 MUC energy to utilize more than 3 times a day in this world. Then there was that. Naruto remained mum on any and all details, but Booker had his suspicions. The kid wasn't from Columbia. He probably wasn't even from here at all. Booker knew not how he knew this, but something was telling him, with every fiber of his being, that Uzumaki Naruto did not belong here. But that was another matter for another time. For the time being, with his arm tended, it was back to the fight. Picking up his pistol, he gave the blonde a glance, realizing Naruto had yet to rise. His gaze seemed focused on a distant point of the adjacent wall, staring endlessly into space with that odd look of his again. It was eerie. How are you feeling? He asked, quietly worried about the blonde's deteriorating health and apparent mental state. The kid obviously meant well enough at any rate, but with every moment they spent together, Booker was beginning to think his time here had driven Naruto completely, and bats hit insane. Of course, that was just a thought. He'd never admit it aloud. Have to break the circle. The blonde muttered suddenly, his words the barest of whispers. Kid. DeWitt deliberated a moment longer, daring to wave a hand before the blonde's face. Earth to Naruto. Oh, I'm feeling better, I suppose. Just like that the moment was gone. Naruto blinked and shook his head, hoisted himself off the floor with a grunt, his face having regained some of its pallor. Shouldn't have what the raisin shuriken back there on the barge like that, though. They take a lot out of you, I know. Booker interrupted. You told me, I remember. You were actually listening. He shook his head, letting the blonde bound ahead of him, just in case they encountered another wave of Comstock's men. Was it growing dark, or was it just him? Cheeky little. Booker stopped shortly, nearly slamming into the blonde's back as he stopped short. Hey, what's the big idea? Naruto merely raised a hand and pointed, indicating the statue before them. It was many times their size, towering over their heads in the resplendent glory of a man-presumable Comstock stabbing at a series of what looked to be a brood snakes, his first armed with a small dagger. For an instant, Booker half thought it might come to life and attack them, just like everything else had in this god-forsaken city. When it did not, when the blonde continued to stare past it, his attention obviously elsewhere, The former Pinkerton took a moment to avail himself of its inscription. Comstock Fights of the Serpent of Nations. He murmured, staring at the twisted statue before them. Not that baka. His companion tapped at his shoulder. Well, that isn't creepy at all. Naruto gulped. For the first time since they'd met, he seemed very much afraid, a very real touch of fear in his otherwise uncaring character. Booker didn't blame him for his fear. Deep in his soul he felt it too. Order of the Raven it read. The words carved into the masked mansion towered before them out of the shadow like a thing alive. It hung there, beckoning to them. The pair exchanged an uneasy glance, silently sharing their old distaste for the dark, gloomy house that beckoned them. Yeah, I really don't want to go in there. Naruto hissed. It's probably got ghosts in there and I hate ghosts, so do I, but we really don't have much of a choice. Gritting his teeth, Booker flung the door open and stepped inside. Muttering an imprecation beneath his breath, the blonde followed him into the darkness. In hindsight, events started to move most rapidly after that. Crows. They were everywhere, Booker realized. They hung from the mantels, picked at unkempt food upon the tables, nested in the rafters. Shat upon the floor. Everywhere you looked there were dozens of the damned things with no signs of human life whatsoever. As if the mansion's occupants had just up and left. Or so they'd thought. Scouring the room clear of salts and ammunition, the two men ascended the stairs, warily approaching all but a horde of crows. Said birds seemed to pay them no mind whatsoever. But it wasn't the birds that bothered Booker, it was the blonde beside him. Naruto seemed to grow more and more agitated with each step into the raven-infested mansion. It started with a worried glance here or there. Now his fingers kept twitching toward the hand of the absurdly long knife he'd acquired somewhere during their travels, as if he were just looking for an excuse to use it. He was visibly on edge, anticipating trouble at eve. Then, at long last, they met the members of this so-called Order of the Raven. Booker poked his head around a doorway and hissed softly to himself, his eyes widening ever so slightly at the sight below the balcony. Well, this explained a lot. There were dozens of them down there, many men and women garbed in eerily similar attire like the Ku Klux Klan, only burgundy within color. After all he'd seen and dealt with in the city of Columbia already, one might think Booker Dewitt would have become desensitized to such sights and images. But this was another matter. At the center of Theorem all in scent. Stage a lone figure stood. His body shrouded in crows, WHP in hand, relentlessly flogging a Chinese man. With each flagellation he preached to his so-called brothers of the crow, voice growing in pitch, becoming warped and shrill as the seconds ground on. And so, the prophet led us onward, and demonstrated to the Sodom below, the true mission of our. It certainly didn't help that he had a slighted opinion of racism to begin with. Usanuva Beach. Disgust roiling within his gut, finger twitching toward the trigger of his machine gun, preparing to unleash a wave of leaden da upon his foes. A hand closed around his wrist at the last instant, yanking the barrel down before he could fire. Naruto met his gaze evenly, shaking his head slowly. Any sign of dementia was gone, replaced by a cold solidarity. Even as he started to protest, the whiskered warrior seemed to ripple, vanishing in the blink of an eye, taking the hand from his rifle. Seconds later, the poor victim on the stage vanished, reappearing only a few feet from where Booker himself crouched, his prone form flopping to the floor in a heap of nerveless arms and legs. The blonde had substituted himself for the SLV as easily as one would draw breath. The hell? The Order of the Raven below seemed to be of a similar opinion. Cries of shock and dismay came from below. Evidently they did not like having their scapegoat removed. What devilry is this? The crow demanded. No devilry. Naruto's voice rang calm and clear. Just ninjutsu. But you wouldn't know about that, would you? Silence. Crows burst forth from the man, engulfing the blonde in a shroud of swarming, shrieking birds. That blonde abruptly burst into a plume of smoke. The vigor-wielded whirled, seeking his enemy, tracking the blonde, but he was nowhere to be found. Trickery, he declared. Deceit. Show yourself. In the name of the prophet, I command you show your Gonna have to stop you there. Naruto whispered into existence behind the crow, knife in hand, eyes bright with something dangerously akin to ferocity. never was one for prophets or prophecies. With a single and effortless flick of his wrist, he sent the man's head toppling from his shoulders. In the chaos that followed, many men died, leading to an excessive waste of ammunition on both sides. When it was all said and done, that eerie enemy vanquished, Booker found himself honestly expecting, well, more. Between him and the blonde it had been almost easy. Bleck. He glanced at Naruto expectantly, momentarily bemused to find the blonde sniffing a vigor he'd recovered from the man's corpse, now recoiling as though he'd been physically struck. Dewitt ducked when he tossed it to him, his hands closing around the blue bottle, warily eyeing its crow head. "What, you don't want any?" Naruto stuck out his tongue. "No, thank you. It smells awful." "Right, forgot about your heightened sense of smell." Bracing himself, the former Pinkerton uncrewed the cap. Steeling his stomach and liver for the onslaught of foul liquid he resolutely drank. This time there was none of the fire and flames of Devil's Embrace. Instead he saw only a single crow, perching upon his arm. And then it was over, the eerie vision vanishing within the blink of an eye. "Told you," the Uzumaki snickered. He was seriously beginning to dislike these vigors. Just as he found himself beginning to love the skylines. There was just something so exhilarating when it came to rushing upward on the rails, suspended only by a single wheel. It was also innately terrifying, more so for Naruto, who was forced to run along that rail on foot just to keep up with Booker. Just imagining the level of concentration it must take to actually run along such a thing, and curving line constantly dipping up and down, rising and falling, it was enough to make his head swim and leave him physically ill. How Naruto did it, he'd never know. And he'd never have the chance to ask. "Stand down." A voice boomed from above the skyline, reverberating through the walls of the nearby buildings. "Stand down." Booker dismounted to find the guards kneeling in reverence, not for them, but the unseen voice. Warily, they passed H. The Prophet Comstock loomed before them in all his glory, his massive visage outlined on one side of a blimp, dominating the sky. He leered down at them with impotent fury, his bushy brow dark with clouds of fire and fury at the sight of these two interlopers. He loomed there, glaring at them until Booker finally pulled the crank that sent the lift rising into the air. "I know why you've come, false shepherd," Comstock declared, his every word dripping venom and bile. "I see every sin that blackens your soul." His voice thundered down at them like lightning itself. Wounded Knee, the Pinkertons, the drinking, the gambling. And of course Anna. "And now, to repay a debt, you've come for my lamb. But not all debts can be repaid, Booker." "You don't know me, pal." Booker growled, irate that this prophet would presume to lay claim to such things. Behind him, Naruto said nothing. He kept one eye to the unmoving supplicants below, and another to the massive blimp above. Undaunted, Comstock continued. "Prophecy is my business, Mr. Dewitt. SBLD is yours. Do you know why these men will die for me? Because I have seen their future in the glory, and hence, they are content. What brought you to Columbia, Booker? Bring us the girl and wipe away the debt. This will end in BLD, Dewitt. But then again, it always does around you, doesn't it? It always ends in BLD." Then his gaze swept toward Naruto, as though truly seeing him for the first time. "And now we come to you, boy. Don't think I do not recognize you. You come here not to aid the false shepherd, but to ruin my lamb, to steal her away for yourself, to sully her innocence." Shut. Booker barely even saw the hand sign, only that a gust of wind had ripped the blimp from its course, cutting the transmission short. Its pilot tried to course correct, but the resounding gale was simple too much, and with a ponderous groan, the massive vessel drifted away, leaving the lift to ascend in peace. Naruto and Booker continued on ahead, neither daring to speak over what had just occurred. The former because he had no idea what Comstock was on about, and the latter, out of silent spite for his painful past. Their silence could only hold for so long, however. The blonde coughed. "So yeah, I think it's safe to say he doesn't like us." That got a laugh from Booker. "No, I don't think he does." "Want to get a beer after this?" Naruto asked. "You know, after we save the girl and homicidal maniac stops trying to kill us and all." The former Pinkerton couldn't help but shake his head at the thought, a wry smile. Naruto was crazy enough sober. Abruptly, Naruto paused, stopping short. say Booker. There's something you should know before we go any further. The blonde's expression went from speculative to something inscrutable. I respect you. At first, I thought you were a complete and bumbling buffoon. A simpleton who needed protecting, guarding, a weakling, some sort of burden meant to weigh me down. Gee, thanks. The point is, Naruto cut in, that I was wrong. After all this, I'm proud to work with ya. For what it's worth, you would have made a fine shinobi. Hey, you've come to lead my lamb astray, but thy crook is bent and thy path is twisted. Comstock's voice ripped through their ears to silence his sentence. Evidently he was not so easily swayed, nor was he content to try and take the not-so-subtle hint that the blonde had so eloquently given them. Go back to the Sodom from which you came. A massive explosion ripped through the wall between them to punctuate his words, tearing into Naruto's exposed back thanks to his shielding of Dewitt. The resulting shrapnel threw the poor blonde off of his feet and bloodied his back, throwing him bodily against the former Pinkerton. God, the blonde growl, spitting BLD as he collapsed was flayed open. BSDRD's getting smarter. I actually felt that one. Dewitt hesitated, realizing how weak those words were. Naruto just might be bleeding out in his arms. Kid's just a flesh wound. Naruto tried to laugh it off, but Booker could see it. For the first time, the self-styled sage was actually genuinely concerned. By some miracle he shook off the older man's arm and actually managed to stand on his own power. Around them the building was pitching and yawing, unable to stay aloft, having suffered so much damage. It would be a small matter for him to jump the gap from building to airship, but would Naruto be able to make that same jump? If he couldn't go, as if sensing his thoughts, the shinobi hissed out a warning. I'll be right behind you. Look, I'm not leaving, I said go. Naruto gave him a furious shove, launching him away with a start. Go back. Comstock roared, shouting over his attempts to be heard. Booker did neither. He bounded through the opening left by the explosion, Naruto limping at his heels, barely making the gap. He could see a glance that the blonde wasn't healing. It was a small wonder he was still in one piece after taking a blast like that. All thoughts of sympathy left him as the building collapsed behind them, leaving the two men trapped on the airship with an army of irate men. One storm off bullets and shadow clones later and they officially owned said ship, had it all to themselves. It would be child's play to guide it to Monument Island. They didn't even pause to consider the innocuous robe-clad woman near the helm. That proved to be a mistake, one that would cost them most dear. But before that grimly, Booker began the lengthy inspection of checking the blonde's wounds. Naruto's back had indeed been savaged by the blast. He lay slumped on the floor, his coat in tatters, barely breathing. He afforded Booker the wanest of smiles at his approach, a touch of his old confidence returning as the older man began to apply gauze to the bloodied trenches in his back. His shoulder had nearly been blasted right down to the muscle itself. It was a small miracle he can't even raise his arms at all, let alone speak. Told ya I'd be right behind ya. Naruto exulted, lisping around the BLD in his mouth. Did ya think you'd be rid of me that sly? Unfortunately yes. Dewitt sighed at the blonde's easy behavior, but the words were without rancor. Remarkably, Naruto was already healing. Red light seemed to stem up from within his flesh, knitting flesh and bone back together as though it had always been. Within 5 minutes, the blonde was able to stand again in some fashion. 10 minutes had him up and about, good as new, well enough to hazard an attempt at the airship's controls. The skyline stretched out before them in grand expanse, milky white clouds lining the horizon as far as the eye could see. The sky was the limit. They could take this airship anywhere. Anywhere at all. That was when the barge loomed before them. Comstock stood upon it in person as though to mock them for their feeble effort to outmaneuver him. God forgives everything, he said, sounding surprisingly contrite, the microphone rising his voice over the wind. But I'm just a prophet, so I don't have to. His head bowed once, as though in signal. Booker turned just in time to witness the woman raising the torch to see Naruto's knife fly into her throat. BLD spurted, but in her last moments she managed to drop the torque herself, setting fire to the entire vessel in a blaze of dying glory. Within seconds the inferno had spread to the rest of the ship, engulfing its wooden frame before Naruto could even consider putting out the blaze with his ninjutsu. Ironically, both men shared the same thought in that instant. Oh, why is everyone in this city so suicidal? Booker shared Naruto's opinion as they swept down the skyline, missing the airship's explosion by a hair's breadth. Even from this distance, they could still feel the heat of the blaze searing into their skin, still witness the death of the mighty craft, hear its frame creak as it steadily sank down into the clouds below. It was a grand sight, broken only the knowledge that they were indirectly responsible for it. But the skyline cared not for all they'd gone through. It resolutely carried them onward to their final destination, Monument Island. He dismounted roughly, his shoes scraping the pavement seconds before gravity caught up with him. Naruto alighted behind him, no less gracefully, clearly worn from surviving such a near-death experience. The kid had his limits, Booker reminded himself, flashing back to the grievous wound on the airship. He wasn't immortal. Well, there it is, Monument Island. It felt like a weight had lifted off his shoulders just by saying those words. Wonder why they got her locked up in this place. One way to find out. Naruto cleared the gate in a single bound. Booker leapt onto the skyhook after him. Another statue awaited them from beyond, its warning no less dire. A ceramic angel held aloft a scroll for them to read, another prophecy of gloom and doom for the so-called Sodom that was earth below their feet. The seed of the prophet shall sit the throne, and drown in flame the mountains of man. What a bunch of shit. Naruto stared at the statue a moment longer, then he did something with his fingers. It was far too fast for Booker to even begin to see, but whatever it was reduced the angelic fixture to a pile of powder at their feet. Booker arched an eyebrow. It was almost sad how used he'd grown to such things in such a short time with the blonde. It was almost scary. DMN prophets and their proheses. Naruto entered the building at a run, crashing through the doors like a bull through a china shop. He spared no time for the fancy baubles or scientific equipment, nor the facts that he and Booker the only living beings present in the entire building. He was far too focused on finding a way out of the hell into which he'd been cast. Until they reached the siphon. Just standing in his presence made the blonde feel weaker. It was as if that machine was somehow actively conspiring to escape the very chakra from whose body. Naruto gazed up at the siphon in undisguised anger. Let's get away from this thing. They delved deeper into the bowels of the beast, passing experiment after experiment, riddle after riddle, until at long last, they finally found what they sought. Filled with trepidation, Booker pulled the handle. Metal shutters slid back to reveal what lay beyond the looking glass, that which they had been seeking for so long. Soft blue eyes shone out from within the heart-shaped visage, her face framed by auburn-colored tresses before being bound back in a ponytail between her shoulder. As they looked on, she tucked a strange of hair back behind her ear, as though glancing at a mirror. Double-to-slee, she couldn't see the two men watching her from behind the window pane. She clutched a photo lovingly between her hands as if meant the world over to her, and given the terms of her confinement, it probably did. She turned it end over end in her hands, silently beside herself with glee. In that instant, Booker caught a glimpse of the precious photograph, fade and worn of years of tatters. It was a picture of a young Naruto. Abruptly she cringed, dropping the photograph with a pained wince, her full lips opening in a small moue of pain. A tiny pinprick of BLD slipped forth from her finger. She waved it painful as they looked on. But just as quickly as she had flinched, so too did she recover. She snatched back up the picture and darted from the room, running well past what the window allowed them to see. The grate slid shut after her, ending their idyllic little scene with a dull clank of metal. Then that was that. Booker watched her go, and held his tongue. He turned back to Naruto, half expecting some kind of snarky comment. None came. The poor boy looked as though he'd just seen a ghost. Elizabeth, he whispered. That was her, Elizabeth. He lunged before Booker could catch him, his fist striking the window pane where mere moments ago, the girl had been. It splintered with an audible crack, but it did not shatter. Even his superhuman strength had its limits, it seemed. Naruto snarled and cocked back his fist for a second strike, then seemed to reconsider, recognizing the futility of such an effort. Life itself seemed to leach from his features, draining forth of his very soul, leaving a shriveled shell of a man behind. I take it you knew her? Naruto nodded, a jerky motion that set his head to bobbing. We used to play together as children. His voice sounded far and away, eyes glassy and distant. Then he shook his head, clearing the memory. That was such a I don't even know how what's she doing here. DeWitt wisely held his tongue in this instant. Any comment on his part might be enough to send his estranged ally over the edge. At length, when it seemed that Naruto wasn't going to try and destroy his surroundings again, a tentative inquiry pushed past his lips. Are you alright, kid? It all makes sense now, the blonde murmured brokenly. All makes sense. Evidently Naruto and this Elizabeth shared some sort of connection. Naruto. He shook him roughly, jostling the young man to and fro. Naruto. You need to snap out of it. This is not the time to lose your marbles. His face seemed to regain some of its color. I can't fall apart now. Not when I'm so close. Elizabeth. He strode on ahead woodenly. Each step seemed as though it were made by that of a puppet, manipulated by some unseen puppeteer, an unknown maestro of strings. Elizabeth. The name was like a litany. I have to see her. Have to tell her. Clearly the sight of her had gotten to him in more ways than one. Booker followed the blonde at a walk, keeping his own counsel. Certainly, this was the girl he was meant to use to settle his debts. And yet Naruto's reaction unsettled him. The next pane showed the newly named Elizabeth once more, though this time she stood in a different room altogether. A gallery of some strange short pieces of paper littered the room, numerous drawings brilliantly showcasing her level of skill throughout the years. She gazed adoringly upon one such easel, her hands worrying at some unseen point in the painting. Larger than all the others, and more masterfully made, it depicted the likeness of a small village over which a mountain with 4 faces presided. She gazed at the painting for a long moment, then did something with her hands again. The air itself tore apart, exposing another world. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been sundered, exposing another time. Another place. A war. Chaos raged around this world within and without, men and women dying in the streets, blood shed by the gallons, a world utterly engulfed in flame while strange warriors strove against one another. For seemed one of them noticed her. A man started toward her, drawing what looked like an iron knife from his pouch, intent obvious and deadly and not at all polite. Fleeing for their Elizabeth closed the tier with a yelp, but not before a kunai got through. It slammed into the window with a dull thunk, cracking the glass between them. She stood there a moment longer, still cringing, before finally realizing she was no longer in mortal peril. Hot tears burning in those large eyes, she all but fled from the room. Slowly, warily, Booker risked a glance at Naruto. If the boy had been pale before, then now he was bone white, trembling from head to toe. That was my village. His words were a throaty gasp. Just what the hell happened while I was gone? He began to wander again, his steps winding towards the next door. I always wondered how she was able to find me, though, to appear out of nowhere. Now it makes sense. Elizabeth. It all makes sense. All makes sense at the end. The third and final window revealed nothing special. Elizabeth had gone to the library, her sadness forgotten, now staring longingly out the window pane. Once more the vision of loveliness vanished, leaving the two of them to their thoughts. Booker. There's something you should know before we go any further. The blonde's expression had gone from sorrowed to something inscrutable. Somewhere down the road, you're going to make a decision. To make that choice doesn't even begin to cover it. It's gonna happen with or without my help, either without me. Live or die. Die or live. Whichever it'll be, when that time comes, I want you to think carefully before making that choice, you know. It may seem silly now, but I feel it needs to be said. If you make the wrong one, I'll end you myself. He swung open the door and strode forward, his gaze fixated upon the door at the other end of the corridor. That was where Elizabeth must be. He never once considered that she might be right below his feet. Senuva Baich. Naruto felt the floor drop away from him with such suddenness that it took his breath away. He didn't even have time to blink before he was sent plummeting to the ground. His hands closed around a rail just before he could crash to the earth, latching onto it like a leech. He peered upward and almost immediately found himself confronted with a familiar face. Her face. Up close she looked almost just as he remembered her, only all but a decade older, lovely as a flower, gentle as a summer's breeze, and all he could manage was a weak-sounding, "A long time no see." She yelped and threw a book at him. Naruto raised a hand to ward off the weapon only to lose his grip on the banister and topple to the floor in a heap of arms and legs. His world exploded into a sea of stars and storms. She threw another book after him, this one connected solidly with his head, causing even more pain. "Hey, I'll knock it off. Will you stop it?" He ducked as a particularly large textbook whistled over his head. "Will you stop it? I'm not here to hurt you," he shouted, but to no recourse as she darted up to him, a slim book labeled The Principles of Quantum Mechanics by a Rosalind Lutece clutched firmly between her fingers. "Who are you?" she demanded, holding the book over his head as though she intended to bludgeon him with it. "Answer me. Don't you remember me?" He was slightly taken aback, hoisting himself to his feet with a groan. "Lizzie. It me, Naruto." He grappled at her arm for a moment, preventing her from slamming the book down upon him in a surge of righteous female fury. "Uzumaki Naruto. Don't you remember?" To this the young woman did not reply. She simply glowered at him, her brow pinched in what might have been confusion and anger. Abruptly, they widened as though seeing him, truly seeing him for the first time. She blinked. Twice. Thrice. Her fingers loosed around the book until it finally slipped from her hands altogether. Now it was her hands upon his face, cupping his cheeks. "Naruto." She gazed at him in disbelief. "It is you, isn't it? How did you get here? I've been trying to figure that out for the last year." Anything else she might have said died when Booker tumbled down to land in a heap at their feet. "Who's this? Friend? I can't believe it's you." A lilting whistle interrupted the tender moment, piping up from a nearby statue. "He's coming," Elizabeth exclaimed in a hushed tone. "Why, you've gotta go." "Why?" Naruto had no intention of leaving, he'd only just gotten to see her again after all these years. "You don't want to be standing there when he gets here, just a minute, I'm getting dressed." She hollered the last part a lie at the gaping hole in the ceiling, from which the noises were coming. It sounded as if a bird were chirping at her. A very large bird. "I can get you out of here." Booker had since found his footing, now he wearily clambered to his feet. "There's no way out." Elizabeth shook her head in denial. "Trust me, I've looked. Stop it. You're too impatient. That's enough." She screamed once more at the hole from which Naruto and Booker had fallen. "Then I'll make one." Naruto turned toward the glass, crossed his fingers, and raised a hand toward the glass. Before she could think to warn him, he struck down with all of his strength. It was like striking steel. His fist simply bounced off, rendering his strike utterly useless with a few broken knuckles to boot. What about this?" Booker held up a key. "What about it?" Naruto and Elizabeth exclaimed as one. "It's the way out, isn't it? Ryu. Give it to me." Elizabeth moved it into the lock without hesitation, wrenching it within the tumblers and opening the door. Freed from its captivity, the frame creaked open a few inches. Nothing more. Together, the three of them were able to wedge the stocky iron block even further, prying it open with their combined strength. Even as they worked as one, an unearthly shriek ripped through the library, sending all three of them to cringing within these hallowed halls. Whatever it was, this cruel creature was coming closer. "What in the hell is that?" Booker growled. "It's his job to keep me locked up in here." Naruto grunted as he was able to force the door open just enough for the pair to wriggle through the gap. The songbird, as if summoned by the mere mention of its name, a massive thud signaled the arrival of the very creature that had been threatening them with its calls. Its bulk filled the library, angry red eyes clicking down at them behind its glass lenses. Its massive wingspan spread wide, the beast began to advance, intent on capturing and/or ending them before they made their escape. Elizabeth and Booker had only just managed to squeeze through, leaving Naruto in the midst of wedging it open when the bird struck. Its massive fist walloped the door and wrenched it from his grasp, slamming it in the blonde's face, leaving him here to face the furiously fierce fiend. Alone. "Weldman," he whistled, peering up at the monstrosity looming over him. "That saw Big Bird. Dance with me." Reunion. The songbird was a creature of flesh and metal, both man and machine, nothing less and nothing more. It did not feel emotions in the sense as humans did. The bloated organ that passed for its heart only knew three: wariness, anger. It did not experience pain as most normal humans did. Such a thing was all but irrelevant to this creature of metal and flesh. Whatever it had once been, if had been anything before this, those memories were long since lost to it. Now, it was simply the songbird. Only one purpose could motivate it to action: pursue it, drive it. Elizabeth. Its task, nay, its very duty was to protect her, safeguard her, keep her in the tower, safe from any and all harm. It was content here, within this wretched existence, so long as the girl was safe. It knew not what caused it to become so dutiful, so fierce in its protection, only that its very being hinged on her continued existence. It cared for the girl, and so it would keep her safe. Boys. That was not just its task, but its very duty. And today, it had failed in its duty. The man had taken his ward away from her room, away from the tower. Elizabeth. It longed to go to her, to return its angel to her roost. It would find this man, crush him, kill him. But later, in order to do that, first Songbird had to get past or through the young one barring its path. He had stayed behind while the thief fled with Elizabeth, his countenance unflinching when the door slammed in his face, when presented by its massive bulk. It was as if he felt no fear, as though he delighted in wrenching its ward away from her roost. This angered the songbird. He stood there before him now, tall and unafraid, his whiskered cheeks quirking in the slightest of smiles. He was grinning, chuckling despite his imminent demise. Yes, there was something strange about this one. He'd not screamed in terror or fear at the sight of it as most did. If anything, he seemed amused. His mirth might have worried the songbird, had it not been so hell-bent on reclaiming Elizabeth. As things stood, he was merely one more obstacle in its path, one more enemy to kill. You know, the blonde mused aloud, I'm almost glad they left me behind. Now I can tear you to pieces without scaring Lizzie. Lizzie, a nickname, an acronym to shorten or disguise she of whom he spoke. But the bird knew of whom he spoke, and its great glowing eyes pulsated an angry red. The young one spoke of Elizabeth. For all the monster it might have become, Songbird could still understand the human language, and the word that had just left the young one's mouth incensed it to no end. Elizabeth. Something about the way the young one said her name sent its three emotions into a frenzy. Abandoning all attempts at intimidation, the metal monstrosity struck with a screech. Its massive fist shot forward with alarming speed, clawed fingers plowed into the blonde, pulverizing every bony in his body to fine powder. At least, that was what the songbird had intended for him. Instead, it found its fist caught, a single knuckle snared within the palm of his hand. The young one slid backward from the force of intercepting the blow, shoes digging angrily against the floor as his body absorbed, then dissipated this excess momentum around him, pushing it aside as effortlessly as a bowl would water, flowing harmlessly around him and to the side. Books flew forth their shelves, flying free from the sudden strike to buffet the blonde and bird in a whirlwind of literature. Yet still the former held his ground. Shrieking in confusion, Songbird struck out with its remaining arm, only to have the young one intercept and stop this blow as well. The young one laughed at its failed attempt to take his head, his pupils dilating as increased adrenaline began to pump through his system, his visible eye crimson, bright with bloodlust. His teeth gleamed with a wolfish light in the shadow of his ragged locks, his lips parting for an almost amused sigh as he held the bird back through sheer strength alone. And then, to the bird's horror, he started forward. Slowly at first, within a step here, gaining an inch there. Slow. Inexorable. And although the guardian of the tower did struggle and strain against him, in the end, it was all for naught. The young one was stronger. Disbelieving, the songbird beat at him with its wings, shattering the reinforced glass of the viewport and summoning up a sinister storm, seeking to throw him from the room. When that did not, it hammered at him with its head, trying to skewer him on its great beak, succeeding only in forcing the blonde to release it and step away. Its relief was momentary, however, as scarce had it escaped the clutches of the young one than the blonde pounced, roaring like a lion, SW like a demented boxer. The next few minutes felt like hours to the songbird. They raged back and forth across the room like a force of nature, laying waste the tower around them with their own private war. Boy versus bird. Man against machine. Time and time again the songbird thought it had him. Time and time again the boy proved it wrong, either by slipping out of its grasp or simply dancing away. Whenever it tried to flee, whenever it sought to pursue Booker and Elizabeth, the shinobi would drag it down that supernatural strength and move it into combat once more, forcing the great Goliath to continue this futile struggle. As though the young one were toying with it. He weathered all of its attacks with a practiced ease, those that were inflicted healed almost instantly. And still their battle continued, laying waste to the great monument tower with each room that they destroyed, an unholy force of destruction that knew no pause nor cessation, one that would only end when the other was dead. At one point the songbird managed to break away. It nearly had the girl within its grasp, only for the warrior to drop an elevator on its head. An elevator of all things. With that they were sent plunging back into the tower once more, forced to return to the great library where their struggle had first begun. Its wounds added up shortly afterward. A loss of an arm followed by a chip of the beak, its right eye now cracked and all but useless to it. And still the young one Naruto tore it apart piece by painful piece. Wrong. This couldn't be happening. Wrong. This shouldn't be happening. Wrong. Its primitive mind began to label the young one with that one word. The young was wrong in every sense of the word. And the songbird had learned this too little, too late. Now it would pay the ultimate price for trying to stand between him and what he sought. It realized with a sudden flash of epiphany, possibly from its mortal days. The insight was there one moment and gone the next, replaced only by a terrible numbness when its left wing disappeared, torn to oily tatters by a flick of the blonde's wrist. A harrowing crack of bone and metal signaled the end of its opposite wing as well. Wrong, deprived of any and all means of escape, the brutal bird began to chitter softly, a terrible realization seizing hold of its addled mind. It was going to die. That's right, my friend. Naruto tittered softly, as though reading the birdman's innermost thoughts. Let me ask you, does a machine like yourself ever experience fear? Scarce had he spoken than his body burst into golden great knees, the likeness of a giant kitsune erupting upward from within, filling the room with its translucent girth. Its transparent form towered over the songbird as though it were the merest of specks, eclipsing it in a shimmering shroud of the purest light. The blonde stood within this great beast, whole and human, his slitted crimson eyes surveying all beneath him with a cold disparity as chilling as it were frightening. At the sight the songbird felt its BLD, or what amounted to BLD, quiver momentarily. Indeed there was something off about this one. Something more than wrong. Unnatural. Yes, that was the word. The young one shone like a second sun. Impossible to stare at over long. But it was more than that. For the first time in its many years of existence, the bird actually felt, it seems I was right after all. Naruto mused, ending To's thoughts with a powerful swat of the paw. A machine can feel fear. That massive maw creaked open, and the songbird, pinned beneath that mighty limb, was powerless to do anything about it. Rest in pieces, bird brain. It was in that instant, as those great jaws closed around it, as the tower came down around them, as the rending of flesh and metal filled its ears, that the great Goliath realized something. A machine could indeed feel fear. Elizabeth wasn't entirely sure when the tower fell, she knew only why. Booker had ushered her through the tower, but even so, she'd caught fleeting glimpse of Naruto's battle with Songbird. Her childhood friend looked to have the upper hand for the duration of their short-lived fight from what she saw, even dropping an elevator upon her protector as he strove to keep it from catching up to them. But now she couldn't see him at all. A terrible pit formed in the center of her stomach, threatening to sap the very strength from her legs even as she ran. What if he was dead? The thought nearly caused her to stumble. Were it not for Booker, she might have fallen. Even so the thought stayed with her, haunting her every step, refusing to allow her a moment's peace. If he was truly dead, then all these feelings were for naught. She hadn't forgotten him, not once since they were children, dreamed of him, prayed that she might somehow see him again. Just one more time. Just a once. For those prayers to be answered, only to be dashed mere moments after seeing him again. Her heart couldn't bear the thought of it. A horrendous screeching sound arose from below, the sound of metal being ripped from metal. Elizabeth slowed, suddenly torn between fight and flight. She could help him. If she could open a tear, then maybe Booker Dewitt was suddenly there, his large hand encompassing her wrist before she could take another step. "Let me go." "Don't worry about him," the former Pinkerton soothed. "I don't know about before, but the kid can definitely take care of himself now." Despite herself, the brunette wavered. "How do you know that?" "I've seen him in action." She could see it in his eyes. This Dewitt fellow had the utmost faith in the blonde. Whether that faith remained rooted in his propensity for violence or skill remained to be seen. "I certainly hope that you're right." "I am," he reassured her. "Now hurry." Booker ushered her outside, leading her to the top as the battle raged on below. Bits and pieces of her former home were being torn away with each step, ripped apart by the twin titans raging below. Scarcely had they made it to the top than the tower itself began to pitch and yawn, swaying with a dangerous intent. If this continued, then the whole structure itself might dash. The young woman had just enough time to recognize the all-too-familiar lurch beneath her feet before the ground was violently ripped away and they were sent flying into oblivion. By grace of God, Booker somehow managed to grab hold of a nearby skyline with his scythe as they fell, the device clutched firmly in one hand and her wrist the other. But she could feel his grip beginning to slip. He'd not the strength to hold her for long. Already she could feel his grip loosening, and once he let go, up we go. A strong pair of arms reached down for Elizabeth before she could complete the thought, wrapped around her waist and hoisted her upward to safety, holding her as though she were a blushing bride fresh out of wedlock and he the groom. Well, she certainly had the blushing part down pat, didn't she? Suddenly hesitant, she raised her head, untucking her visage from his chest, daring to look up at her rescuer. He's really gotten rather handsome, Elizabeth realized. All this occurred in an instant, her mind moving at a snail's crawl. Elizabeth barely had time to squeal in surprise before she realized who had saved her from plunging to her death. Who was running across the skyline after Booker, fleet and swift as Hermes himself. Naruto. He was running, across the skyline. She risked a tenuous glance downward, and sure enough, despite the terrible dip and drops, they were winding after the former Pinkerton, even with the extra weight afforded by her body. How one could stand, let alone run against such a headwind, was utterly beyond her. "Miss me?" His grin was positively beatific. That was when fate threw a monkey wrench into the works, in the form the tower's falling debris striking the line ahead of them. For a moment, just a moment, she thought it might hold. Then, as though to dash those hopes, the skyline buckled, the metal rods snapping like twigs. Somewhere ahead of them, Dewitt cursed. Hang on. For all of his powers, Naruto couldn't hope to fight gravity. Neither could Booker. And certainly not Elizabeth. Even with her ability to open tears, she simply could not negate the momentum they'd built up. Deprived of their lifeline, the three of them fell, plummeting towards the waters below. Water. Wait, if there was water, then that meant they were near. Naruto saw the waters of Battleship Bay rushing up to greet them, and his smile soured. He did something with hands then, and the waters rushed upwards in a spout, sending them hurtling towards. Oh, this is going to hurt ground. For every choice, there is an echo. With each act, we change the world. One man chose a city free of law and God, but others chose corruption, and so the city fell. If the world was reborn at your image, would it be paradise or perdition? His eyes opened to blackness. Everything felt numb, and yet he somehow still felt. It was as though he were standing outside of his body, dimly observing his surroundings, watching the wretched world of Columbia from an even greater distance. But wait, this wasn't Columbia, was it? Columbia, for all of its dark elements and racial superiority, was, on the outside, sunshine and clouds. This was not that. There was no sunlight wherever he was now, only the artificial illumination afforded by glow lamps. This was not Columbia. This place wherever here was held nothing more than ocean and brine. A city beneath the sea. Bone-tired, he rose, shaking the grit and grime from his shinobi attire. The corridor stretched before him, wide and yawning. There was nowhere to go but forward. And so go he did, until a door finally barred his path a heartbeat later. Securus, it's some kind of security company. Scarce had he thought this than the door whirled open with a twirling of cogs, revealing a horribly abandoned and filled with water corridor. Cracks were on the glass panels near the windows, where small rivulets of water ran their course to the drains on the floor, but those weren't what garnered his attention. It was the words. Various phrases and signs littered the corridor here and there, each one more confusing than the last. Finally, he came to one that made some sentiment of sense. A man chooses. ASLV obeys. Naruto took a moment to admire the hubris of those words. Did SLV have the right to choose? Of course she did. That choice was always the right one, but it was a choice nonetheless. But did man always have a choice? No, not always. Sometimes those fated choices were forced, move upon him like an oxen's yoke. His musings ended abrupt when someone decided to clobber him with a monkey wrench. For all his ungodly regenerations, the sage in the clouds could still feel pain in the conventional sense. And he felt it now, felt it as stars' whole planets detonated across his vision in a kaleidoscope of stunning agony. He staggered half a step forward, barely avoiding having his brains beaten in a second time. He turned, pivoted, swiveling to face his supposed assailant, only to find himself staring at a face straight out of his worst nightmare, its face gross and disfigured, body riddled with pus-covered pustules, its limbs gangly and distorted. The sight of it was so grotesque that Naruto actually flinched, just for a moment. Can't have her. A keening voice issued forth from the man's twisted rictus. She's mine. Methian. Something massive rose up from behind his attacker, accompanied by the sound of a revving engine, punctuated by the voice of a little girl. Daddy. The drill tore through the face of the splicer in front of Naruto like its head was made of butter. A giant hulking creature, wrapped within an iron diving suit, looked at him with a ghastly yellow glint from its visor. Its right hand pointed at him, displaying for a brief moment the Greek symbol of the Omega on its gauntlet's back. He stared at this metal monstrosity for a long moment, wondering what it would do next. And then, as if to mock him, the Tin Man did what he least expected. It removed its helmet. Naruto froze and closed his eyes, opened them again, blinked. BLD red eyes gazed back at him from a face that he knew all too well. Recognized, even here in the depths of the sunken city. His face. Horror dawned on him as he found himself staring at another version of himself, an alternate every bit him, save for those horrific crimson orbs and darkened whiskers. The little girl's hand reached down to pat that face, giggles of delight fleeing from her lips as he reciprocated the gesture. So frail, so tiny. Her hand hovered just past that scarred face, her own visage gaunt and gray. The yellow eyes wide with awe. "Who's that, Daddy?" she asked. "He looks like you." Well, the other Naruto rumbled, his voice 2 octaves lower than it ought to be, as though someone had scooped his vocal cords out of his chest and put them back together out of order, eyes narrowed and intent upon this strange specter. "What do we have here? A savior or harvester? Gatherer or reaper? You could be one, but you can't be both. So, which are you, other me? Are you a merciful savior or a vengeful spirit of death? Whatever you can't be both." A hoarse laugh issued forth from that face. Believe me, tried. Just like that his features began to burn, fire twitching up past his booted toes to consume him, and the little girl on his shoulder. They burned in silence, neither offering so much as a single syllable in their agony. "Keep the girl safe," the now burning Omega whispered as his features fell away. "Whatever it takes, keep her safe," Naruto screamed. What in the blue hell? He woke from the nightmare, or was it a vision? Blearily, stirred to find someone breathing life back into him. Quite literally. A pair of soft lips covered his, and he could feel a warmth breath ushering vitality onto his lungs, having just performed compressions in a desperate attempt to keep his heart beating. Apparently it worked. His eyes flew open, locked with hers. Elizabeth. He could read the shock in her eyes. Naruto. He stared back at her overlong, as did she. An eternity passed between the two. Then Elizabeth jerked back as if she'd been burned. "I'm so sorry." Her words rushed out in a torrent. "You weren't breathing, so it's fine. Grunting, the blonde hauled himself into a sitting position. An uneasy silence crept upon them after that, neither willing to meet the other's gaze after their accidental embrace. The waves tried to lap at their toes, gradually reminding the blonde of their location where they had fallen despite his best efforts to the opposite. He could smell the salt of the sea, see the beachgoers in their strange striped bathing suits, hear the sounds of music, dancing in the distance. His mind instantly supplied a name for this place: Battleship Bay. The beach looked like a beach when in fact it was anything but. They were still in Colombia. Still in this god-awful world. Still, who are you really? Naruto's head snapped back like a puppet severed from its strings, because Elizabeth had asked that question in Japanese. It had been so long since he'd spoken his own language. To hear it from another was the most heartening thing in all the world. Well, perhaps the second best. Sitting here with his long-lost friend, reunited after all these years, that was certainly better. It's me, Naruto, he ventured at last, choosing his words with care. I guess you could say I work for your father, or something. I have a father. The way her eyes lit with hope tore at his very soul. Where is he? He's right there. Naruto wanted to scream as he saw Booker sprawled out on the beach, but instead of staying screwed shut, his mouth offered different words. He's in Japan. You mean Konoha? So you remember? Those words were not a question. The same could not be said for the next. Anything else? I remember your friend, Sakura. The blonde hissed. That was a damned long time ago. Naruto, Elizabeth whispered, I know being locked since I was born in a tower, watched all day, makes me ignorant of the world, but I'm not an idiot. You say you work for my father and my father is in Japan. That's too good to be true. Then again, you're probably too good to be true too. She actually averted her gaze, a light blush coloring her cheeks as she said that. Oh, now she didn't. His own eyes widened. What? He whispered, his breath caught in his throat. Are you saying I'm not real? Isn't that obvious? Her reply caught him flat-foot. You promised you'd get me out of this tower. I haven't seen you since then. 13 years, Naruto. Her pained cry almost distracted him from the tears shinging in those bright blue eyes. Why come for me now, after all this time? How did you even get here at all, if you're not some sort of ghost? The ghost? Well, Diamen. He couldn't well tell her that last one now, could he? He didn't even have the answer himself. Having simply woken here in the city one day, he'd gone to explore only to find himself trapped in the awful sea, until Booker broke him free. In the end, he settled for the only answer he did have, himself. Strong arms wrapped around Elizabeth before she could speak again and drew the distraught brunette close, pulling her head into his chest. The hardened notes of his body met all her feminine curves in an embrace as soul-searing as it was warming, tightening even as she struggled within his grasp. His long-lost friend. Could a ghost hug you? He said, breath warm upon her ear. Still, Elizabeth resisted. She really didn't believe it was him. Let me go, she pleaded, sniffling softly. Just let me wake up, please. This is real. He snapped back. In the next instant he reached down and pinched her arm. Not enough to draw BLD, but still. She cried, lurching free from his arms. He let her rail against him in anger. Why did you do that? See, if this were a dream, if I were a ghost, you wouldn't have felt that. Just like that, the DMN broke. She was suddenly in his arms again, no longer resisting, no longer struggling, but crying. Here in his arms, sobbing softly against his shoulder. It was suddenly all he could do to soothe her, stroking awkwardly her back as best he could without laying his hands. This scene. This embrace. It all seemed familiar somehow. He'd done this before. Hugged someone like her before. But who? Who could have possibly? Unbidden, a name rose from the blackened depths of his memory, a name he hadn't even been aware until this very moment. Eleanor. If Sakura's name had been a poke, that name was a rusty knife to the chest. A crushing pressure descended upon his, threatening to all but force his mind under as a sea of nostalgia crashed down around him. Had to save her. Had to save the little sisters. No matter the cost. No matter what. Memories not his own threatened to drown him, to drag both his body-soul back down to that rotten, watery world. He fought them with all of his might, refusing to parley with the thoughts of his other self, of the armored titan from his dream. "Your nose," Elizabeth murmured suddenly, shattering the impasse. "It's bleeding." Naruto blinked and drew away. Touched a hand to his face. "Not this again." Her hand was suddenly there, dabbing at his nose with a handkerchief. "Keep the pressure on," she soothed. "I'm sure it'll pass." Naruto grumbled his assent. "How do you feel?" "Sore," he relented. Using his powers on the water at the last instant, forcing all the chakra to the ground in an effort to soften their landing had been taxing, to say the least. "I'll see if I can find something for the pain." She skittered off before he had the chance to call her back, already out of earshot before he could think to remind her of his regeneration. He would be fine, given time. Until then, he supposed he would wait, sit here amidst the shore and recover his strength. Elizabeth. Naruto was suddenly and intensely aware of just how good it was to see her again. How much he'd missed her. She'd always been like this, ever since they were children. Always fussing and fretting over him whenever he got into a fight, wherever he hurt himself or bit off more than he could chew. Being only 7 years old at the time, this was quite often. Still, it was pleasant, her clumsy attempts to bandage him always serving to remind him just how much she cared. Then she'd vanished when he was 8 years old, and he'd never seen her again. In time, the pain of her passing had dulled, but he'd never forgotten. The memory of her was always there, just under the skin, waiting to be remembered. Seeing her again now, after all these years, it was like welcoming an old friend. Gradually, he became aware of Booker Dewitt. The former Pinkerton lay sprawled on the sands beside him, his chest rising and falling with life. It simply wouldn't do for the man to die after all they'd been through together in the last few hours. But he would die, eventually, wouldn't he? Once he'd been sure. Certain. Now, he wasn't sure of anything anymore. His knowledge of the future, of this endless, absurd sea whistle in which he'd found himself trapped, was severely limited. Restrained only to the man who'd freed him from it, that DeWitt had daughter was here in Colombia, and he would die during his botched rescue. He hadn't known Elizabeth played a part in any of this until he'd laid his eyes on his long-lost friend, seen her again after all these years. Then everything had fallen into place. Elizabeth was DeWitt's daughter. And God, talk about your catch-22, boy. He growled, shaking Booker by the shoulder. DeWitt, wake up. We need to talk. The man groaned and swatted his hand away. Gimme a minute, Naruto. Sighed as he watched his tenuous ally pass out again seconds later. Booker Dewitt. A man of many mysteries, but none to him. Booker Dewitt. What if his involvement alone wasn't enough? Would telling him the truth break the circle, this endless sea whistle of which he'd become aware? To tell or not to tell? An extremely familiar voice piped in from behind him. That is the question. Another voice, feminine, remarked then. Naruto spun around quickly, somehow a Rasengan in his hand already, and as he narrowed his eyes the Lutece twins looked back at him with their usual indifference. The chief and perhaps only difference being that he was now the center of their attention instead of DeWitt. You again, he remarked. You're early. Are we? The man said. Aren't you the one early? The woman said. The blonde groaned. Look, I really don't have time for this. They resolutely ignored him. Subjective, isn't it? I thought it was conjunctive. You're using the wrong word, brother. Am I? You are. Or perhaps I'm right that you're wrong. That's the same Robert, the woman chided. Rosalind, you're a sore loser. Robert remarked. No, I am not. Yes, you are. If you two are done, Naruto commented, pinching the brow of his nose with his right hand. I'll be going now, see. He doesn't even want to ask. Robert pointed at Naruto with both his hands outstretched. It shows I'm right. Ask what? Why you are aware, Rosalind sniffed, crossing her arms across her chest. Knowledgeable, despite all efforts to the contrary. Naruto took a moment to contemplate that. Clearly these two were much more than they were letting on. Perhaps they could help him in the long run. But he'd play their little game. For now. So what am I aware of? He asked. The fact that Booker will, you mean of the ending, incorrect? Rosalind cut in with a shake of her head. Your other self, was the clarification. The dreams. Visions. Robert corrected. Alpha. Omega. A beginning. Or perhaps an end. Killer of men. Mayhaps a rescuer of children. Reaper. Savior. I'm neither of those things. Naruto replied. I just want to get out of here and back to my own universe, preferably with Elizabeth. You see. Rosalind smiled, smug in her satisfaction. The means may be the same, but the methods are distinctly different. The methods are the same. The means are different. End of the story. Robert snapped back. The bird is gone. A major obstacle has been removed. Oh really? I'm not seeing how that changes anything. Because it will, Robert muttered, before turning around to give his back to Rosalind. There is a wild card at play here. If so, then why can't we see it? Rosalind retorted. Because it changes things. Or maybe it does not. It does. Naruto blinked and they were gone. Just like that. All that remained were sea and sand. As though they'd never been. Was all of that in his head? He certainly hoped not. He had enough voices in there already. Naruto. I think I found something for you. Begrudgingly the blonde blinked and returned his attention to Elizabeth, now staring at the medic kit that his childhood friend had apparently scavenged from a corner, holding it out right in front of his nose. Her look seemed so much like that of a puppy that he was fighting off his longing to hug her again. If it was because she disliked seeing people hurt, or because she was falling into some sort of savior complex mode, he didn't know. Regardless, he gladly accepted it from her hands and used it to mend both his and Booker's wounds. I'm sorry it took so long. She apologized as he fastidiously applied a poultice to the former Pinkerton's arm. Then she frowned, watching the blonde move a mass of water with his hands. Wait, what are you doing? A heartbeat later, she had her answer. Wake up. Naruto promptly dropped the water on Booker's face, sending the man spitting and sputtering with a start. The hell was that for? Good. Naruto observed mildly. You're awake. And you're a pain in the butt, you know that? You are correct, sir. Why, you little. Booker tackled him then, sending the blonde sprawling onto the sands. Elizabeth couldn't help herself. She gave a most unladylike snort at the plight of the two men. The way they were scuffling with one another was almost comical. She watched her childhood friend grapple with Mr. Dewitt a moment longer, making absolutely certain that they wouldn't harm one another, before she turned and went her own way. She was just curious, she told herself. Yes, that was it. It was, after all, her first time outside her tower, so it was only natural to want to see the sights. The girl looked around for a moment, before her ears actually seemed to twitch. I think I hear music. It was not until they'd reached the outermost corner of the beach that Naruto and Booker finally found her on the boardwalk. She'd given them quite the scare, running off like that during their little tussle. Both men had feared her lost, or worse. But no, there she was, laughing her head off and dancing at the center of it all. There was such joy in her expression that it struck at Booker's very soul, and yet when he turned to say as much to his blonde compatriot, he recalled that to Naruto, she was of even greater value. He still had to get the girl to New York, of course, but what was the harm in she's all yours? Booker waved his comrade ahead. For the first time since they'd met, the blonde actually looked frightened. No. No, 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 no. 1,000 times no. What are you afraid of? Music. Naruto made a squelching sound as he gazed back at the dancing crowd. I'm not afraid. Looks like it to me. The latter's smile was barely concealed. It was such a rare sight to see the blonde genuinely unnerved. Besides, after losing their little brawl, he'd take whatever small victory he could get out of his hide, ridiculously petty though it might be. I'll prove it. Scowling, the shinobi stalked past him, his determined stride and strange attire drawing more than a few scowls from the men and more than the occasional appreciative looks from their womenfolk. Before long he'd all but reached the pier, his long gait forcing the former Pinkerton to job slightly just to keep up. He hung back as Naruto reached the throng of people, well aware that his face as well as the mark on his hand would draw unwanted attention to one such as him. And so he stood there, watching as the hilarity unfolded. Elizabeth extended a hand unto Naruto as she twirled in place. Oh, won't you dance with me? No. The blonde sweat dropped. I didn't think that's such a good idea, Lizzie, please. There it was again. Though, The one expression every man feared. Those pitiful puppy dog eyes. Fine, tentatively he accepted her hands and allowed himself to be drawn into the circle. A chorus of appreciative hoots and whistles greeted his entrance. "Here, boys." A man laughed deep from his belly. "We've got ourselves a duo." Nearby, a pair of women seemed to disagree. "She's much too good for him." Naruto bristled. "Don't listen to them." Elizabeth soothed. "I'm quite happy to dance with you." At this, it was the blonde's turn to flush. "Hopefully I'll live up to your expectations." Their first waltz didn't end well for him. He nearly stepped on her foot before he righted himself. For all his skill as a shinobi, this was one art he'd never mastered. He might be able to move at the speed of light. Thanks to Hiration. He may have exceeded his father, the legendary Yellow Flash, in sheer skill. He might have even become the Hokage someday, if he hadn't been yanked from his dimensions and into this one. And yet, for all his stamina and skill, Uzumaki Naruto simply couldn't dance. Elizabeth noticed. "My goodness, aren't we clumsy?" she teased at him, earning a growl from her partner. "Oh, be careful." He stepped and stumbled around her to the laughter of the crowd, determined not to trot on her feet at the very least, but making a complete butt of himself otherwise. Elizabeth, for her part, tried not to laugh too much. Other men and women joined in around them, perhaps encouraged by his dismal dancing. After all, surely they thought they could fare better than this uncoordinated blonde. Somehow, that riled him even more. "Arg," the blonde swore, his thoughts broken when he nearly tripped over his own 2 feet. "Don't overdo it and break an ankle." His partner cautioned. Damn it." Naruto swore at himself. "I can do this." Scarce had he spoken than the music became less rousing, its festive tune decreasing in pace. They paused together, listening to the whistles of the crowd. "Now this I can do," he grinned. There wasn't man alive who didn't know how to slow dance. Elizabeth seemed to agree. She stepped closer to him, draping her arms round his neck, smiling softly as he placed his hand upon her slender hip in turn. She moved first and he followed, careful not to stumble again. "Just follow my lead. Step, step, twirl. Easy. Step, twirl, step. There you go. Twirl, step, step." Slowly, he began to find his pace in the rhythm, allowing her to lead him, following that lead dutifully until at last he found his proper place. He was barely even aware of it when the music livened up again, so lost was he in those appealing blue eyes. He simply moved when she moved, advanced when she retreated when she advanced. His rhythm rightly aimed, he found himself smiling, laughing when the crowd cheered them, their earlier boos and jeers all but forgotten as they danced merrily about. But all good things must end. So too did the music, the crowd clearing away as the band announced that they were finished until the evening. Naruto and Elizabeth were left alone on the pier, still staring listlessly at one another. At last, reluctantly, it was Elizabeth who released him, though not without a touch of regret. "You're a fast learner," she applauded him. Naruto beamed. "I try." More might have happened, had not they seen one Booker Dewitt. Just how much of that did you see?" Booker chuckled. "Enough. Come on, you two lovebirds, we've got an airship to catch." He indicated the distant First Lady airship floating past, a massive blimp that dwarfed them all. Though his words caused her to flush, Elizabeth frowned, cocked her head aside in confusion. "I don't understand," she said. "Will it take us to Konoha?" Naruto sighed. He'd known this would happen sooner or later. Maybe if she'd been interested in Paris this would have worked, but as things stood he was fairly certain she wanted to see Konoha. Not the war-torn world his universe had become, that was no place for her, but the peacefully idyllic days they'd known in their youth. DeWitt demurred before Naruto could think to try and stop him. Idiot. Didn't he realize he was lying to his own daughter? No, of course not. To him, Elizabeth was just a girl, a stranger he'd been told to bring to New York in exchange for the settling of his debts. He had the succinct feeling this wouldn't turn out well. But were he to call his bluff now, then he'd probably shatter the tenuous understanding Booker had just begun to build with her, not to mention the realization that only a tear could get him back home. Which meant he needed Elizabeth. More than ever. "We'd best be going then," he replied. The smile she gave him was utterly heartbreaking. "Tell her, you fool." His mind screamed at him. "Tell her." But he did not. Despite his better judgment, Naruto decided to keep his mouth shut. This time. By then he'd become vaguely aware of her hand in his. Though they'd separated, she still had yet to release him. He thought about saying something only to decide he rather liked the feel of her hand in his. As though it were meant to be there. As if it always had been. Shaking his head, he followed after Booker, Elizabeth in tow. Being with her again was all that mattered. Everything else could just go and burn. And if Booker Dewitt proved to be more trouble than he was worth, he would burn too. So would the world if it stood in his way. Little did he know how prophetic one of those thoughts would prove. I know they're scared out of their wits by that girl. Yes, sir. They've got a tiger by the tail, and they don't know whether to hang one or run. A voxophone recording. Blooded, you're going to get wrinkles if you keep glaring at me like that, missy. Daisy Fitzroy scowled at him, this strange blonde staring her down from across airship. There was just something about him that left her ill at ease. Something odd. He'd resisted all attempts at capture, but otherwise had proved a damned sight better than their Vox's field medic, dressing wounds, sticking sores, applying poultices wherever needed. All this in the span of a few minutes. He was either a very good doctor, or a spy sent by Comstock to bring them down, she theorized. Honestly, Daisy had begun to lean toward the latter. More than Anki, the prophet had sent a seemingly kind soul to infiltrate them, only for said person to be no more than a yellow-bellied coward. If this was another of those, there we are, the man mused, running his bloodied hands over the sink. You'll likely lose 1 or 2 with infection, but the rest should live. His words trailed off as she placed a pistol to his head, his smile dipping down into a slight frown as the cool barrel pressed against his head. Now is that really necessary, miss? I just tended most of your men. And you're going to shoot me for it? That depends, was her reply. Who in the blue hell are you? Their unlikely savior exhaled, a long-suffering sigh that seemed to make him many years older. His crimson eyes regarded them narrowly from behind the dark-rimmed sunglasses he wore to cover up the scars lurking behind his eyelids. The name swell, that's actually not important. He relented with a laugh. Now, ma'am, if you'd put the pistol away so we can discuss this like adults. Something about his voice was soothing, compelling, it made her want to obey without quite knowing why. And that frightened her. I ain't no ma'am, boy. Hi, I can see that. He waved his fingers and suddenly, the pistol was ripped from her hand and placed into his, carried by an invisible energy. Now, would you kindly sit down? He gestured with the weapon and Daisy froze, well aware of the trigger cocking backwards, of her body obeying the command, against her will. How had he dash? Sit, he gestured again. Again against her will, she complied. What do you want, boy? Boy, the blonde affected a hurt tone. I'm not that much older than you. At this, she-Blackette growled. What? The blonde's grin reminded her of a humble saint's, modest and demure. Rather ironic, considering the Vox's modus operandi. I've got a proposition for you. And that would be... Impossibly, his grin grew another inch. What would you say if I gave you this city on a silver platter? I'd bullshit. But I'm listening. The man who wasn't yet not Uzumaki Naruto laughed. You can call me Omega. I happen to be an acquaintance of dear old Naruto. Although he doesn't know it yet, meanwhile, I missed you. I'm sorry. Naruto blinked, taken aback by Elizabeth's word, having missed most of them. The declaration had come from seemingly out of nowhere as they made their way deeper into Battleship Bay. Until now, it had been a relatively silent, if leisurely pace. Almost sedate, even. Everyone seemed content enough to catch the moment of respite while they could. After all, who knew when they would be fleeing for their lives again? No, he'd been quite content to take what little peace he could get. And he'd been happy with it. Until she'd gone and said that. I said I missed you, she repeated quietly. Well, I missed you too, he tried, fumbling for an answer. Hadn't they gone over this already? Strange, he was almost certain they had. Naruto, he was suddenly intensely aware of her, her body pressing against his as they leaned against the rail, the overly sweet smell of cotton candy drifting between them, mingling with the artificial scent of the sea. She was curled into him, her body warm beneath the blouse she wore, chin resting comfortably upon his shoulder. Without thinking he reached around, fingers curling around her waist. "But I'm right here," he insisted, pulling her closer. "I still missed you," she sighed, nestling her head deeper into his shoulder. "After all this time, it's just so strong to believe that you really came." A soft sob leaped from her lips. "I'm not dreaming, right? You told me this was real, but I just, hey, don't start crying." It was Booker, not Naruto, who spoke up, looking equally distressed. The blonde glowered. "Don't interrupt the feels, DeWitt." But the feels? Now that they'd found each other again, she didn't seem to want to let go. It was insufferably adorable, if he was entirely honest with himself. Having her on his arm just felt right. When he was with her, he could truly be calm, could forget the chaos of the universe, of the strange, myriad forces that had ripped him from his world and into hers. Not that was complaining. He'd gotten his best friend back. That was all that mattered to his selfish soul. "It's all right," he soothed, his hand tracing small circles on her back. When that did nothing to assuage her tears, he held her at arm's length, hands clasping tightly to her shoulders. "You're safe. We're here." She raised her gaze, and suddenly his hand was there of its own accord, cupping her cheek. Together. Her cheeks turned scarlet. Together. "Era, what we meant to say was," Booker groaned. "Will you two just embrace already? People are starting to stare." "Era, what was that, Scumson?" Naruto raised a finger, a tiny raisin shuriken circling at the edge of the digit. "I didn't ask for your advice. I'm really out," she murmured, pulling away from him, looking around at the beach. "I can't believe it, aren't you coming?" Before he could reply, she darted back and grabbed his hand, tentatively threading her small fingers through his. Then she pulled, tugging him after her. Naruto couldn't help but to follow, smiling. He'd do anything to keep her from making that face again. More than anything else in the world, he never wanted to see her cry again. "This is real, I just don't believe it." "I'd say believe it, but I don't speak those words anymore." Naruto chuckled, let himself be led along the pier. "Bloody English dubs." Booker looked back. "What?" "Nah, it was nothing." The group passed by in contented silence after that, climbing the stars to the pier and leaving the gentle sounds of the artificial sea further and further in their wake. Ahead he could hear cries and laughter, the sound of merriment causing his heart to skip a beat. It must have excited Elizabeth as well, because the pull on his hand grew more insistent, veritably dragging him along. Booker was absolutely no help at all. He seemed perfectly content to watch him squirm. Oh, there would be a reckoning for that. "Will you quit smirking, you cheeky bee?" Elizabeth paused before a poster of Comstock, and the words turned to ash in his throat. Seeing Comstock's face served as an agonizing reminder that this fairytalite couldn't last. Booker didn't know the truth of the man gazing back at him, but he did, at least in part. This was the BSRD responsible for it all, the man who had altered one world, and in doing so, forever changed his own. Oh, how he longed to wrap his hands around the effer's neck and. "So this is Comstock?" she asked, her words drawing him out of his reverie, back to the present. "I've heard of him." Naruto fought down a hiss. "I don't like his look." Booker agreed. "It's eerie." "Do you dislike the look of the prophet, miss?" The attendant frowned sternly, "or his gaze?" "Watch it, friend." Naruto found himself rumbling. "She's with me." The man seemed to recognize him. "I know you. You're the Whatever else he might have said died as a fist smashed into his face and shattered his nose. He swayed there for a moment, eyes rolling back in his head, until a soft breath from the blonde toppled him like a house of cards. Naruto hummed softly, shaking his now blooded fist, looking quite content with himself. Better. Much better. He'd nearly struck with lethal force, remembering only to hold himself back in Elizabeth's presence at the very last second. Still, that didn't make it any less satisfying. I think I dislike you." Elizabeth had a death grip on his arm by this point. "What did you do that for?" "What? He's just another idiot caught up in the lie. I wasn't about to stand there and let him preach. Besides, he knew me. Couldn't take any chances. You can't just punch people like that. He'll live." Still, that was something snapped. He tried so strong to keep up the front, to put on a happy smile for her, but he just couldn't do it anymore. If it means keeping you safe, I'd do a lot more than that. Naruto snapped, losing control of his tongue. What do you think's going to happen once they realize who you are? You think they'll just let you go? The people here want you, they need you, and given the chance, they'll toss your pretty head right back in that tower or worse. And I'll do anything to keep that from happening. Didn't she see? Didn't she understand? She wasn't safe. She would never be safe. Not here, not unless they got the hell off this floating castle and out of here. Anything. Anything. Her ears turned pink. Can we leave now? She begged, pulling on his arm. "I don't like it here." He had the distinct feeling it was more his words than anything else that caused her to scoot closer to him and grip his arm as she did. She'd not been frightened by his words. If anything, she seemed fixated on moving ahead, at not looking at him. Had he embarrassed her? Once more he let her lead the way, but once more, they found themselves waylaid. "The bird," Robert said. "Or the cage," his sister offered. "Or perhaps the bird." Naruto felt his eye twitched. "Oh, for the love of, will you stop popping up like that?" Booker glowered at them both. Robert and Rosalind, how did they just keep appearing out of thin air? Naturally, Naruto was compelled to choose the bird. The last thing he wanted was to remind Lizzie of her terrible time in the tower. Her captivity. All alone, locked up in that gilded tower, felt his chakra pulse just. Thinking about it, the shroud all but shimmering into existence around his shoulders. He'd slaughter Comstock for this. No death was too good a punishment. First he'd start with the toes, then fingers, then his hands. Naruto? He blinked, realizing where his thoughts had gone again. It was a frightening thing, knowing that for each moment he spent here, he lost more and more of himself. More and more the longing to hurt and kill and maim was growing within him, to tear this place apart for the horrors it had inflicted upon someone so sweet, so kind, so gentle, and they'd hurt her. Torn her apart. Broken her. Shattered her. She'd never be the same again, and I was all their fault, and he wanted to hurt them. Gotta watch that, he warned himself, shuddering at the thought. Thinking like that's dangerous. The ghost of a smile plucked at his face. The one on the right. Grinning, she affixed it to her choker. "Oh, I love it." "What?" She stood up on the tips of her toes and pressed a swift embrace to his whiskered cheek with a beaming smile. There was a pause as he realized what she'd just done. The deliberate display of affection nearly floored him. That was when the sputtering started. "Www what?" Elizabeth giggled. "You know, you're pretty cute when you blush," not helping. In that instant he was infuriatingly aware of Booker's chuckle. But perhaps, had he known what was to come, he would have chosen the cage. "I exist. Elizabeth." Tails heads. Or
Okay, sadly the chapter is over. And if you enjoyed, just leave a like and subscribe with post notification, so when the next chapter is ready, you will be notified. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye.